All right. So what we're going to be looking at today is it's sort of a more theological stand back look at the forest kind of topic, and it's really so we're focusing on what does Matthew think about Jesus? What's the understanding of Jesus, which we'll find in the Gospel of Matthew. Okay. So let's jump into that, and of course, just so people are practicing their Greek and staying right on top of things. I'll get Stephen Briggs, who got the prize for Intro to Biblical Languages. All right, so what we've got there, of course, is Biblos Genesios Jesu Christu, huiu David or Dawid, and huiu Abraham. So the book of the beginnings of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. That, of course, is the opening line or the title line on the scroll of the To Evangelion Kata Matthew, Matthean actually. So this is Matthew's opening line, or his kind of headline statement. The book of beginnings, or the book of Genesis. So evoking, pushing some significant theological buttons there straight away. The book of the beginnings of Jesus Christ, and that even. You notice it's unusual there are no articles. I'm sure you all noticed straight away there were no articles on any of those proper names, proper nouns. You expect Yesu and David and Abraham all to have articles. So this is very basic. So again, it probably reinforces the idea that it's really a title rather than a sentence in that sense. Okay, but it's interesting. Struck my interest the other day that by the time Matthew is writing, even just at the level of his title for the the front top line of his scroll, Jesu Christu is basically a double name already. Not Jesus who is called the Christ or Jesus who is the Christ, but Jesus Christ. I mean, it's like, so by the time Matthew is writing, around about 100, Jesus Christ is an established term. Okay, so he doesn't speak about Jesus without just automatically latching on what is actually a title. And because I guess I'm taking it as a given that everybody in the room understands that Christ is not a name. Christ is a title, a position, a role. Okay, and yet it has become a name by the end of the first century in Christian use. And indeed, even in Paul's letters, it's become a name. It's become part of the regular way of referring to Jesus. So very, very early on in the Christian tradition, Christos, even though it's a problematic title, because he doesn't fulfill the CV, he doesn't meet the key selection criteria to be a Christos, a Messiah, nonetheless, this is absolutely central and integral to the Christian, hence the word, Christian tradition, that Jesus is the Christos. However that gets reinterpreted, massaged, and so on, to say, well, no, not that kind of Messiah, this kind of Messiah. But nonetheless, the Christ dimension is absolutely bolted on from very, very early on in the tradition. And it is problematic, historically and theologically and politically. It doesn't go down well in a context where Rome is suspicious of potential rebels. Okay, it doesn't go down well with your Jewish neighbours, and it doesn't make sense to pagans, to Greeks. So everything is stacked against this word. It should not have survived, and yet it is absolutely bolted in. So it must be. So that's the sceptical historian saying, so what are the criteria for dissimilarity and so on, and for difficultness and so on? This is not something the church decided about 150 AD to chuck onto the pile of many other titles that Jesus was being honoured with. This is something that emerges from the very earliest stages of the tradition. Okay? And then son of David, son of Abraham. We'll come back to son of David because that is a title that recurs in Matthew's Gospel, whereas son of Abraham does not. However, Matthew's genealogy, of course, is going to trace Jesus back to Abraham. and that's a very significant identifier in terms of the Jewishness of Jesus. Whereas Luke, as you may recall, takes the genealogy back as far as Adam, with the wonderful phrase, and he was the son of Adam, who was the son of God. Okay, and sort of file that away in the back of your head for a bit later on as well. Okay, so let's get into it. So how does Matthew see Jesus? So what we're going to be doing, I hope, in the next hour or so, is actually to pay attention to the data that's in the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, so we've got to filter out what we believe about Jesus, or what we know, in inverted commas, that everybody knows about the early church, about Jesus. And we have to, in particular, had to filter out information and New Testament Christology information that only comes from documents like Luke or John or the letters of Paul. Okay, because as far as we can tell, Matthew is not a great consumer of the letters of Paul. He has a rather different view on Torah observance, for instance, than Paul has. Having said that, it's also interesting that, the big issue about Torah observance in the Pauline communities was, in fact, male circumcision. Okay? Never gets a mention in Matthew's Gospel. Very rabbinic, very Torah observant, wanting to be more Jewish than the Jews. Circumcision is not, in any sense, an issue in the Jesus tradition. It's an issue in the Pauline tradition, not in the Jesus tradition. So again, how big a debate was that stuff in Galatians and Romans? Or was it looks bigger to us because Paul is such a big part of the New Testament? Okay, but if you zoom back out and try and get a sense of early Christianity, I know that's the kind of thing Sue likes doing, that bigger picture kind of history stuff, maybe it's a bit of a storm in a teacup in terms of earliest Christianity, because it doesn't, it's not just Matthew, it doesn't show up in any of the Jesus traditions in the Gospels, including the Gospel of Luke, even though the book of Acts is aware of the controversy. Okay, it doesn't feature in the Gospel of Luke. Yeah?
What does it mean to draw a distinction between the Jesus tradition and the Pauline tradition? What do you mean?
Well, the traditions about that part of Christian tradition, which is remembering, preserving, and if you like, perhaps even creating the Jesus tradition, which eventually we find in the Gospels. So for us, primarily, the Jesus tradition is the four Gospels. And, a few other early Christian Gospels that don't make it, but you can date to earlier than 200 or something like that. So you've got this early Jesus tradition. Now, the Pauline tradition is embodied and found in the text attributed to Paul, again, whether or not Paul wrote them. So this so-called 7 authentic letters, plus the pastoral epistles, plus Ephesians and 2 Thessalonians and say Colossians that are seen as deuterocanonical, and then you've got the letter to the Hebrews. So you've got about 13 kind of Pauline letters within the New Testament. 26 documents in the New Testament. 26? 27. 27 in the New Testament. 39, 27, 66. All right, so the Pauline tradition is both the letters of Paul, but it's also that sector within early Christianity which is connected with Paul and his activities.
The Synoptic writers were building the tradition of Jesus. Paul was applying it as he saw.
Well, one of the we're playing with two or three sets of problems here. One is that the letters of Paul come before the Gospels. So, and Paul dies, before somewhere around 64, 65, something like that. So Paul knows nothing about the Jewish rebellion. Paul knows nothing about the written Gospels because they don't exist yet. Now, that does not mean that Paul knows nothing about Jesus and the traditions about Jesus, and yet, just as the book of Acts never mentions Paul's letters, which is puzzling, Paul's letters never mention or rarely quote Jesus. Paul doesn't remember the Lord Jesus, and it never refers to parables, doesn't refer to, So if you actually try and tease out what does Paul explicitly indicate that he knows about the Jesus tradition, information, it's very, very little. And if we didn't have the Gospels and we're trying to do a profile of Jesus based on the information about Jesus that survives in the letters of Paul, we wouldn't have much to go on. We'd have no aphorisms, no we wouldn't even know that he was a person who was a teacher and who told parables. All we would know, basically, unprepared, 1 minute summary, we'd know that he had a Jewish mother, Galatians 4:4, big surprise, and we'd know that he was crucified and raised, and we'd have the Last Supper tradition from 1 Corinthians 11. I passed on to you what was passed on to me, the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed. So we'd have just that 1 Corinthians 11, 23 to 26. That really it's basically the words of institution, but it's on the Lord Jesus on the night he was betrayed, took bread and said. Now, that indicates that Paul's familiar with the basic passion narrative, Last Supper narrative. But nothing else in the Gospels really makes any mark on the letters of Paul. So people then talk about sort of trajectories running through early Christianity. And this is not the only model, but it's one that's quite influential for the last 100 years or so. So you talk about the Pauline trajectory, the Johannine trajectory, and the Synoptic trajectory, or even you can break it down to the Lucan and the Matthean. But Luke is normally seen as part of the Pauline school of thought. And of course Mark and Matthew are related as, first edition, second edition kind of thing. And then you get Q. So if you buy into the Q hypothesis, then the Q represents the earliest stage of the Jesus tradition, which is in fact parallel to Paul's letters, but is not explicitly drawn upon by Paul. And of course Q would not have the Last Supper narrative because it's a collection of sayings. So Paul hasn't got the Last Supper out of Q. So if you're trying to and this is the stuff I love doing, if you try to reconstruct like a map of who's who in the zoo in the first century Christian community, who's not talking to who's playing with who, all that kind of stuff, then you get into this sort of conversation. So what I'm saying here is for the purpose of our focus on Matthew in this subject today, let's look at Matthew's Christology, basically, but let's try not to import into Matthew what we know from Paul or what we know from John, because whether or not Matthew, inverted commas, knew that material, we're trying to understand Matthew's take on it. It doesn't mean we don't notice that perhaps, for instance, in Matthew's focus on Jesus as a great rabbinic teacher and indeed a source of new Torah, that you've got a different appreciation of the law than we find in Paul's letters or the Pauline tradition. Okay? So Pauline tradition means primarily the letters of Paul, and by implication the people by whom and for whom that literature came into existence. Whereas the gospel tradition is more how to explain the gap between Jesus and the finished book of the gospel. How do we get there? Did they remember everything Jesus said absolutely perfectly? That's the sort of maximalist position. Did they make it up one night with a nice serve of mushrooms and red wine and they just made it all up at the end? Probably not. So a good Anglican position will be somewhere in between, that it's a mixture of memory and creativity. And as I think I was saying in this class last week, if you're in a religious context, a kind of charismatic, sort of prophetic community, where it's perfectly acceptable for someone to stand up and say, "The Lord, I have a word from the Lord," which Paul does himself, okay? Then isn't that just as much a saying of Jesus as something which came out of Jesus' mouth by the Sea of Galilee? Now, historically, we say, no. That's not how our brain works. But in the ancient world, isn't that something Jesus said, the risen Lord active in his community? And it's just as valid as a saying of Jesus as something that Jesus said and was remembered. historically. So our categories of what did Jesus say, as distinct from what would Jesus do, our categories are more rigorous because of our cultural location on this side of the Enlightenment. And we're so obsessed with, but did he really say it? Well, he did, but he sort of spoke through a hand puppet called Joachim or something. Well, no, but did he really say it? That's what we want to know, okay? Unless you go to the Christian Outreach Centre and have a different set of criteria applying, okay? So we're paying attention to Matthew, and also noticing how our previous ways of, and I don't mean us personally, but can be us personally, but as Christians have read the Gospel of Matthew, our readings of Matthew have been predetermined or influenced by other things we already believe. I mean, we're on this side of Chalcedon. We're on this side of Nicaea. Okay, we're on this side of the Reformation, this side of the Enlightenment, etc., etc., etc. So we tend to approach Matthew through a filter of certain things, and so, even say the second last verse, baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. I can almost see the priest tipping the water on the person's head when those words are being said, because that's the words we use at baptism. But were they the words used at baptism when Matthew's Gospel was written, or was Matthew introducing some sort of novelty with this phrase? Okay? Or was that actually a sort of later addition to the text? So our other stuff we know can so easily affect what we think we see in Matthew's Gospel. So what we want to be paying attention to is what's Matthew's strategy for telling us about Jesus. Okay? Rather than what's Matthew's part in the total New Testament theology of Jesus. That's a different question. Wanting to focus on what's Matthew's strategy as he tries to tell his readers something that he thinks they need to hear. Oops. Now we will be able to pay attention at points to some differences between Matthew and his sources where we have a reasonable ground for thinking he has sources. So, for instance, if there are differences between Mark and Matthew, then we can pay attention to those as points where Matthew has tweaked the draft. Okay? And he said, actually, no, I want to tidy that up a bit. Okay? Make some extra point. We can also note, and this is what we've just been talking about in a sense, we can note convergence and difference between Matthew's way of talking about Jesus and the way other parts of the New Testament talk about Jesus. Okay? So we could note that John, at least in the headline stuff in chapter 1, John locates Jesus within the whole sort of logos philosophy of the Hellenistic world, and Matthew doesn't play into that at all. Okay? Now, if we approach it with the idea that Jesus is the logos and what is Matthew adding to our story, I think we're not going to hear Matthew in his own voice. So what I'm saying, let's try and distinguish what Matthew is saying. So we may be able to see some differences between Matthew and Mark. We may even be able to distinguish some differences between Matthew and Q at points, but that's a bit more problematic. Okay, and certainly we'll be able to notice points where Matthew is more like or less like other parts of the New Testament. And the other thing to bear in that, have sort of on the boil, as it were, on the back plate on the cooker, is whether is Matthew actually offering us a single picture of Jesus, this is how it is, or is Matthew actually intentionally offering multiple images of Jesus? Okay, and that's kind of picking up more the position, say, of Elaine Wainwright, who, if you did get a chance to read through her article, she's talking about not having a single truth, but different communities within the Matthean, or different, what she says, different households within the Matthean community. Okay, telling these stories and retelling these stories and coming up with slightly different truths as they do so. And that's also a clue to how we use the text today. That it's not a case that Matthew has one singular truth which is being expressed, but that Matthew is a bit like an artist playing with multiple hints and leaving us to then run with it. Okay? Now, see what you think about that as we go through it. So there is the possibility, if you pick up the sort of suggestion from Elaine Wainwright, that we'll put some of the readings, different ways of reading Matthew side by side, rather than trying to get to a dominant, singular, you must all agree with me or with Stephen or with whoever kind of approach to reading Matthew. Okay, to actually look and allow for multiple readings of the text. A little bit of Brisbane history there, because Elaine is probably not known to any of you. You know, oh, you know Elaine as well. You know from Toowoomba, yeah. Elaine is. Most people would see her as coming from Brisbane. She's actually from Umbyram, which is a very small community between Toowoomba and Pittsworth. And Wainwright Road leads down to the Anglican Church at Umbyram, which was one of my centres when I was the parish priest at Drayton. Elaine did her doctoral work at University of Queensland with Michael Lackey, who was also my Dr. Vada. So I think I was Michael's first PhD student, and then Elaine was either the second or third of the 12 to graduate. So Michael has 12 disciples, 12 PhDs. And a fantastic person, fantastic scholar, brilliant sort of feminist theologian. She was teaching for many, many years at what is now Banyo ACU, but in those days was actually Pius XII, and then St Paul's Theological College as part of the Brisbane College of Theology. And there was always a line of students wanting to do subjects with her and also do PhDs with her. She's an absolutely top, fantastic person. She eventually fell out with some of the more conservative elements in the Archdiocese of Brisbane, and because she was a religious sister, her position was secure, but a number of lay people were dismissed from the seminary, so she resigned as well as part of her own integrity, and took a position as Professor of Theology at University of Auckland. And she's been there for probably 15 years or so now. And her grandfather there is a stained glass window in St Matthew's Drayton in memory of her grandfather, because the family were Anglicans until her father married a Catholic lady and swapped teams. So Elaine would have grown up Anglican, had been different. Anyway, they're a lovely family, and you know her sister, what you're saying, yeah. So she's one of the heroes around Brisbane in terms of theological education in southeast Queensland, and an absolutely top world-class scholar. So let's push in then. So what are some of the parts of the puzzle that we're going to be dealing with? Well, I'm just putting these up as, spreading them out on the table. So these are the bits we've got to try and find how they all go together. There'll be the titles, and what I mean by the titles are the key labels. I'm not thinking of roles, but titles. So I'm not thinking of things like healer, teacher, but rather things like Son of God, Son of Man, etc. Okay, so some of the titles which are used of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, that's one bit of the data. Then there are the themes or the motifs which Matthew uses. I'll come back and unpack some of these in a minute. I'm just giving you some advanced organisers. And then there'll be the settings and locations where Matthew has Jesus operating as he does the story. And then there's the overall plot, this kind of the storyline that Matthew develops. And again, if you do read Elaine's chapter, which was set for reading this week, and I would really encourage you to do so, particularly the second half, she actually does a sort of reading of Matthew's narrative and pointing out what that's suggesting about the characterization of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel. So the last part of that article is particularly relevant to this issue. Then the way Jesus is characterized, and also other key people in the story are characterized. And then not forgetting that, as always, a key part of the puzzle is who's reading the book at the moment, and where are they from, and what's going on in their lives. Okay, so the readers and their context will also be part of the puzzle. So apart from the ambiguity about some of the other things, because these are not rocket science questions, these are more like art appreciation questions. Okay, so apart from the sort of implicit ambiguity of some of the things like the themes and the motifs and plot and so on, there's much more significant ambiguity introduced by this variation between readers and their contexts. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm going to start with the titles because they're the obvious things, but they have limitations in terms of what they can tell us about Jesus' view of Matthew's view of Jesus. So the titles, each of these titles, I'm just going to list 3 or 4 of them. They all come with baggage. Okay, these are not fantastic new titles that Matthew just thought of when he was writing his gospel, or that Jesus or his buddies thought of when they were tromping around the Galilee. Okay, all of these titles are titles that have history in the Tanakh and also in the post-biblical Jewish writings. And post-biblical is a technical word meaning, basically the text from the Second Temple period and later, but they come after the end of the Jewish canon. So post-biblical Jewish writings means writings that are not part of the Tanakh. So it includes Second Temple literature as well as rabbinic literature. So the word Messiah, the title Messiah, occurs 14 times in Matthew's Gospel. Okay? Son of Man occurs 30 times. Son of David occurs 10 times. Son of God, depending whether you go for which way of shaping the word, the phrase, it's going to occur 9 times. Son of God 6 times and God's Son 3 times. Okay. So in general terms, I think this is the next point, the Son of Man title roughly equals all the other titles combined in terms of frequency. Okay. So part of just getting a sense of the puzzle, bits of the puzzle, that's part of what we're dealing with. Okay. So there are several titles, some of them not used very often, and the Son of Man title used a lot. And we'll come back. Now I'm going to back up and go through each of these one by one, as you will know if you've got the sheet printed off, or you're looking at it on the screen. Okay, so Messiah. Well, as I'm sure we know, the word Christos is a translation of the Hebrew word Messiach, and it means anointed one. And it reflects the idea that when someone is chosen for a special role, be that as a priest or a prophet or a ruler, they would be anointed. They'd have a jug of oil poured over their head. Okay? Sort of like popping open a champagne thing at the end of a race or something, I guess. Okay? So it's about being chosen and secondarily anointed with some ritual action. And the classic example is the prophet Samuel anointing David to become the future ruler, but it's not the only example of anointing of a future prophet, priest, ruler, etc. That's the basic idea of the word. Typically, of course, it referred to a prince from the Davidic house, because the Davidic family managed to maintain a monopoly, a more or less unbroken monopoly, on the throne in Jerusalem, as distinct from the northern kingdom, Israel, where no single dynasty had that kind of continuity. Okay, so there's a theological, historical kind of tendency coming out of Jerusalem to give some sort of priority to the Davidic line when you're talking about anointed rulers. And yet we find, as we get into the Second Temple literature, that it wasn't simply a case that everybody knew what a Messiah was going to look like, what their job would be. So it's not that the Jews were expecting a Messiah to come and they knew what the CV would be, they knew what the key performance indicators or the key selection criteria would be, and Jesus turned up and they didn't join the dots. I mean, there were multiple messianic expectations around in Judaism, and Christianity represents one particular expression of that, where the messianic identity of Jesus becomes absolutely central even to the name of the religion. Okay? And at Qumran, for instance, we find 3 messianic figures being referred to. So the messianic functions could be spread over more than one figure, priestly and royal and so on. But yeah.
There's several messianic figures in the scrolls. Has the Christian movement tried to incorporate all of those styles and say that they are all found in Jesus afterwards? Have they reflected back and tried to incorporate all, or is there a very different style of messianic figure that does not fit Jesus at all?
I think it's more the latter. I don't think it's what you find in the sort of community scroll, the scroll of the community rule, 1QS, is a reference to when the Messiah of Israel comes, he will do this, but the priestly Messiah has to say the prayers, and then there's the teacher of righteousness who also appears to be a sort of messianic significant figure. So we get these multiple roles within Qumran.
So they weren't personalities, like they weren't people, they were describing roles rather than...
Yeah, a Messiah is somebody who's chosen by God and anointed by an appropriate delegate of God to do a job. So even like in Isaiah 45, I think it is, the prophet refers to Cyrus as God's Messiah. I have anointed you, I have chosen you, da-da-da-da-da. And so the pagan emperor is seen as an agent of God's blessing. So that's the exception. Normally, it's a person from the Davidic house in the case of a royal leader, a prince, or in the case of a priest, a high priest and so on, then being anointed was part of their priestly ordination ceremony. So what we find it growing through in the latter part of the Old Testament and through into the post-biblical texts, this is the idea that there will be a time in the future when God will raise up a Davidic prince, and he'll be the anointed one, he'll be the Messiah. So there's connections between the Messiah title and the Son of David title. Okay? And primarily the Messiah was anticipated as somebody who would liberate Israel from its enemies and restore the glorious days of David and Solomon. Now we see that very tangibly in the Bar Kokhba rebellion, because Bar Kokhba was recognised by the leading Jewish rabbi at the time as the Messiah. Okay? And of course, well, whether he was or he wasn't, he lost the war, so it wasn't a very good one. It wasn't a successful one. Okay? And interesting that from that point on, the sort of rabbinic tradition says, Khalas, that's it, we're not doing this apocalyptic stuff anymore, and we're not looking for a Davidic, messianic, political leader anymore. Okay? So they depoliticize for the next 1800 years or so. And of course it's a moot point, even if you look at sort of contemporary Jewish practice, to what extent are religious / orthodox / conservative Jews looking for a Messiah? Okay, it's a bit like the second coming, okay, or it's a bit like the eighth Imam in Islam. Everybody sort of agrees that it's a good idea for Jesus to come back, or the eighth Imam to appear, or the Messiah to come, but nobody really wants our regular routines to be interrupted. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's coming. Not today. Yeah, not today. I've still got stuff to do. Like can I just fit in my trip to Israel first? Okay. So it's interesting. I mean, and if we come across groups that encourage suicide in order to get to heaven quicker, we think they're a bit strange, and I would say for very good reasons. We think they're a bit strange and weird. Okay, but there's a logic.
Not a long-term problem.
They're not a long-term problem. They're out of your hair once you bury them. So there is that. So, for instance, there was a major, you may or may not remember, and he's died in the meantime, but in the 90s and perhaps the early part of this century, there was a senior Jewish rabbi in New York, and he had got to play this game very carefully, because once you claim to be the Messiah, then you can become a false Messiah. Okay? So this particular rabbi is called the Reeb, which is just another form of the word rabbi, of course. That was his affectionate title. He was well into his 80s and 90s and had never been to Israel. Incredibly orthodox, conservative Jew. But of course, once the Messiah goes to Israel, he can't leave. All right? And his followers were convinced that he was the Messiah, but he never actually said so. It's like a messianic secret, which we'll find in Mark's Gospel and so on. And eventually he dies. When you're in Israel, you'll see big photos of him still, big posters, and that he's coming back soon, because his followers have not given up the idea that he actually is the rabbi, and he's the Messiah, and he'll be back soon. He's just sort of popped upstairs for a cup of chai, and he'll be back shortly.
Was he psychotic?
That's a nice medical question. No. I mean, I don't think he was psychotic, but it's this, and it's a very fine line between allowing and even encouraging your followers to suggest you might be the Messiah and claiming to be the Messiah, but being savvy enough not to go to Jerusalem, because had he gone to Jerusalem, he would have had to say, "I am the Messiah," and then the Israeli government would have locked him up, because that's not in the Constitution. I mean, and indeed there are. We tend to avoid Mea Shearim, but if you were to go into the conservative, ultra-Orthodox community of Mea Shearim, the 100 Gates, just outside the old city, they do not recognise the state of Israel, because only the Messiah can resurrect Israel. So the state of Israel is a secular act of blasphemy in the opinion of the ultra-Orthodox Jews at Mea Shearim, because only when the Messiah comes, so they consider themselves to be citizens of Israel and they pay their taxes to the Palestinian Authority. They also take grants from the Israeli government to pay for their yeshivas, but they do not recognise the sort of Zionist state of Israel as a good thing or even as existing, because it's the Messiah. When he comes, he will create Israel. So it's a contested idea, even to this day, what the word Messiah, Messiah, means. Okay? All part of the rich diversity of that crazy place called the Holy Land. Okay? Or anywhere else where people take religion too seriously in some ways. Okay? It can be a toxic. So it's not just a throwaway comedy. I mean, religion and psychosis are not unrelated phenomena. If religion becomes out of kilter in somebody's life, so one of the challenges for us, I think, is how do we practice and how do we be leaders within religious communities in ways that are wholesome and not toxic. Okay, so we've got the message about abuse and child abuse and sexual abuse, but I mean, there are other forms of toxicity besides sexual abuse. And how do we make communities that are wholesome and where humanity flourishes in the name of Jesus? That to me is one of the big challenges for ministry. Because it's actually a temptation to make the boundaries really tight and move into a more sectarian kind of project, where everybody knows what we believe, we're on the program, we know the arguments, we've got the speaking points, whatever. Dunk, 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 dunk.
It's easy to do that.
Yeah, and you can control everybody. Yep, and the trains run on time, and the autobahns are built, and So getting that balance was one of the charisma we're looking for, I guess. So the Messiah image is about the revival of the collective, we'd say national, but nation state is not an ancient idea, but we talk about the ethnic, or the sort of ethnos, the people of the Jewish people, How, in biblical terms, how are the people going to be free and live their life as the covenant people and not be subservient to some other empire? Okay? And what's the and it says, so then the issue becomes, so what is the role of a Messiah in a world of empires? Because if we're just a little tiny group, it's very nice to have a Messiah, but actually the Russians or the Americans or the Chinese or somebody else are the empire. And in those circumstances, Messiahs get crucified. Whether it's a bunch of SEALs coming by helicopter and taking you out in the middle of the night, or whether it's Bar Kokhba, or whether it's Jesus, whether it's John the Baptist, you take out those sort of people if you're in power. You don't leave them there to cause trouble. So it's a difficult title, but it's part of the mix that Matthew is working with. In terms of the text, and this is hits per 300 words, so there you've got a list of the passages where a Messiah, Christos, is used, and as you can see, it's not evenly spread through the gospel. Okay, so you're looking at patterns of use, and we'll see this with the other titles. It's not like these titles are used in varying degrees, frequencies, but they're used consistently through the gospel. They're actually particular terms, particular titles are symptomatic or distinctive for different parts of the story.
So as long as you're using keywords to make a point,
Yeah.
a particular title of the gospel.
Yeah. So you can see there's a bunch of them in chapters 1 and 2, which are the infancy stories. Then it doesn't come up again until chapter 11 once. Then it doesn't come up again until chapter 16, verse 16, which is Peter's, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Okay? And then and then a couple of sentences later in verse 20, which I can't remember. And then we come down, 22, 23 is the conflict with the authorities in Jerusalem. So we're into the passion narrative, and the tension between the messianic figure and the city authorities is beginning to build. And of course 26 is in the sort of trial with the chief priests, and 27 is the crucifixion narrative. Okay? So, it's not just the word and the significance of the word, but it's also where and how often Matthew is using the term, which we have to sort of play with. I don't have an answer, by the way. I'm just taking you through a process here. Son of Man, interesting title. The phrase simply means the human. Okay, it has a generic sense. So if we say sons of Israel, we mean Israelites. Okay. Similarly, if we say Son of God, the Jewish meaning, the Hebrew meaning for that phrase is angel, or God with a small g. In other words, somebody who belongs to the category of gods, an upstairs person, not a downstairs person. Okay? So in the book of Job, the day when the sons of God came to report in to the Lord, Hasatan was one of the sons of God who comes to report on his brief as the director of public prosecutions for the court of heaven. Okay? He's just one of God's officials. And what's his job? He's the DPP. His job is to prosecute people, identify people who are not really doing the right thing. And God says, hey, look at hey, what about Job, eh? He's a good one. And Hasatan says, well, you are kind of looking after him a bit, so why wouldn't he be good? I reckon if I put the screws on him, he'd spit in your face. Rough translation. And God says, okay, you're on. See you in 6 months. Let's see how we go. And he comes back in 6 months. He says, see, I told you Job would be good. He said, yeah, okay, but you've let me kill his children and destroy his property and take away all his wealth, but you haven't let me touch him yet. And God says, okay, go for it. Do your worst. Okay? Now, and Job's going, gee, it's getting uncomfortable around here. Wonder what's going on. Everybody else in the world seems to know, but Job has no idea what's going on. Yeah, that's right. But Satan is one of the sons of God. Now, of course, later on that's not possible, but in the world of the book of Job, And so in biblical language, like Son of God, Son of Man, that Son of meant belonging to the category of. Okay? So one level, Son of Man, like the underlying, in Hebrew, Ben Adam, or in Aramaic, Bar Enosh, simply means a human. Okay? But Son of Man is a funny title because it actually uses definite articles. Okay? And it's different from what you would be doing in Hebrew and Aramaic. So it's come across in Greek as a slightly different phrase, but its core meaning is simply human, or a polite way of referring to yourself indirectly. Okay, like yours truly. So the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head means I don't have anywhere to stay. Yeah, this mother's son. That kind of saying. Okay. But it also is used a few times for an eschatological figure. Okay. Sorry?
In Daniel.
In the Gospels as well. Okay. Now, and the direction of travel changes, as John Robertson pointed out years ago. But in the book of Daniel, the one like a son of man is coming on the clouds to God. Okay, coming into the presence of the Ancient of Days. And so John Robertson's argument was that in his little book, Second Coming of Jesus or whatever, he argued that these sayings where you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of glory are not about the return of Jesus, but about the glorification of the Son of Man after his crucifixion, as he goes into the presence of God. But they have been picked up by Christians as early as the first century as meaning you will see him arriving on the clouds. Okay, but the J.A.T. Robertson's argument was that this metaphor is primarily about the human one making a journey towards God, not coming back, with attitude to sort out the world. But that's actually a misreading. It's basically about ascension, which all dead emperors had to do. In the Roman world, you have the tradition of apotheosis, where as part of the succession strategy from the dead emperor to the new emperor, there'd be a motion in the Senate where somebody would say, I wish to inform the House that the other afternoon I saw the soul of our late beloved emperor ascending into heaven. And there'd be two witnesses, and then it would be passed in the Senate. And the Senate would declare that Claudius or whoever was now divine. And therefore his successor got to be called Son of Divine, Son of the Divine Claudius, Son of the Divine Tiberius, Son of the Divine Augustus. Okay?
Even if you'd assassinated him to get the job?
Well, they didn't give the title to Caligula and Nero, because they didn't, they were not honoured in that way. Okay? So this thing about the eschatological figure, it's part of the Son of Man tradition. So when you look at the 30 places where Matthew uses Son of Man, sometimes it just means me. Okay, but sometimes it means that eschatological figure, the one who will be the judge at the end of time. And that's drawing, of course, on the traditions of Daniel chapter 7, and also the traditions that we find in 1st Enoch. Now, whether Matthew is familiar with 1st Enoch, which is a 1st, 2nd century document, BCE, or whether it's simply that the ideas that we find in Enoch are also ideas which were floating around in the early Christian community and at Qumran and other places. Now, the other thing, and this is just a bit of Jenks being thrown into the mix, I wonder whether part of what's going on, I haven't seen this in the literature, it just occurred to me last night, that when Matthew and others are talking about the Son of Man, and it's an end time figure, and we tend to read it, I think, very tightly into this is the point of the parousia, this is the point of the arrival or the advent of Jesus, okay? I'm wondering if, in fact, what Matthew is doing is playing with the idea of the first Adam and the last Adam. Okay? That you've got Adam in Genesis, who's there at the beginning and messes it up, and you have the son of Adam at the end, who's part of fixing it up, making it all kosher. And I'm wondering whether one of the aspects of the son of Adam, son of man motif in early Christianity is actually that it's not so much a purely eschatological figure from Daniel and Enoch, but rather it's the first Adam and the second Adam, as in the first and the last Adam. And of course, that's exactly what Paul picks up on in 1 Corinthians 15. You know, the first Adam was a man of the dust, the second Adam is a man of heaven. Okay, so the man of dust is called up from the dust by God. The man of heaven is called from heaven to earth by God. So I think there's a nice exegesis or honours project or something around that sort of typology of the first Adam and the second Adam. Okay, and so I also note that, and this came up I think out of Lutz. This is not his big books, this is one of his little books. Lutz studies in Matthew, and he has a couple of chapters on Christology in that book. He makes the point that because of the use of the definite article in the Greek, which does not reflect with Semitic usage in Aramaic and Hebrew, that the Greek term son of man would not have made sense to Greek speakers because of its Semitic background. It wouldn't have made sense to Semitic speakers because of its use of the definite article. In other words, it's a odd soundbite, and for that very reason is a distinctive Christian term. It's also a term which in the Gospels only ever occurs on the lips of Jesus. No one else ever calls Jesus son of Adam, son of man. This is the phrase that in all of the Gospels, every time it occurs, it's Jesus, it's on the lips of Jesus. Okay? You won't find Jesus talking about himself as the Messiah, or as the Son of God, or as the Son of David. But you will find Jesus talking about himself as the Son of Man.
So does that mean in the Jesus seminars that would have got whatever colour it was that ascribed a truth to it or import to it?
Well, the Jesus seminar is looking at historicity, not truth. That's a different level. That's a different colour. No, it's different. Yeah. So they, from memory, and there's a little cameo essay on that in a few of their publications. I just can't remember the details now, but in very broad terms, I think the seminar would have voted for the more, if you like, the more non-supernatural sense of the word, non-eschatological sense of the word, to be authentic to the earlier stage of the Jesus tradition, whereas the more apocalyptic eschatological figure, I think the seminar would have seen. I mean, if I was doing a paper, the way it works is a particular scholar will say, I'll bring a paper next time on that topic. And then at the end of your paper, you actually put in draft propositions, which they're going to vote on. So it's actually a really interesting way of focusing your writing, because you're not just writing an essay to show how learned you are, you're writing to persuade, and at the end, your very last thing is a list of 4 or 5 propositions which you want your colleagues to vote for. And you express it in the way you want to. So one of the items would probably have been, and I could look it up, I just can't remember, the eschatological Son of Man saying represent a theological development in the post-Easter community. Okay, that probably got a red, which means those words are not coming from Jesus, so they get a grey or a black. So it's that kind of a historical judgment being made. So the fact that the later Christian tradition did not use Son of Man to talk about Jesus, that's a title for Jesus we just dropped after the end of the Gospels. You don't find it in Paul, you do find it in the Gospels, but it disappears because the church gets fixated on Jesus as Son of God. And so going around saying Jesus is the Son of Man, people go, yes, and your point is, I mean, what's the big news there? So he's a human being. I mean, yes, most people are. So the Son of Man title didn't kind of have a lot of influence once you get into Christianity. So the fact that it is so strongly represented in the gospel tradition, the Jesus tradition, and it's only ever occurs on the lips of Jesus. It's never represented as something that other people say about Jesus. The one exception being Stephen in the book of Acts, as he's about to be stoned, and he said, "I see heaven open and the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the power on high," which is a dead quote from Daniel, of course. But all of that suggests that within the Jesus tradition, this is a title which is characteristic of Jesus and is not something the later church used, except that within the Gospels themselves we have these apocalyptic, eschatological cases of Son of Man. Now, is that Jesus talking like that, or is that the very early Jesus community? I mean, then you get into, there's a whole essay in that,
Is it
at least.
Is it possible that Jesus, though, would he have picked up, would he have started to use that term, given that you're saying it's a bit definitive the way, I might Greek, but given that it's, you're saying in the definite article, it's a different way of phrasing it. Is that a direct pick up from, then it's translated into Greek, isn't it? So,
Yeah.
So it's not a direct pick up from Daniel. I'm just trying to work out whether Jesus would likely to have pulled this from a history pool, or if he is just saying human one. I know that's not something we can know.
Yeah. The biggest, if you read people like Giza Vermesh, Jesus the Jew, he argues very strongly that the Son of Man sayings are about, "Hi, it's me. I'm talking about myself." It's purely the everyday, normal, semantic significance of that phrase. Now, of course, as you just reminded yourself partway through your question, Jesus was not speaking Greek. Okay? So at no point have we got the actual words of Jesus here. We've got translation into Greek. And so if Jesus was saying it, he was almost certainly speaking Aramaic, not Hebrew. He would have said Bar and Nosh, not Ben Adam. But that's still the question then. So as the early Jesus tradition goes from what Jesus actually said and did, which we would love to be able to access, what wouldn't we give to dig that up? Okay. Not that we can. A whole lot of transfers are happening, and one of the transfers is that it's going from Aramaic and/or Hebrew, but probably Aramaic, into Greek. It's also going from a pre-Easter to a post-Easter context, and it's also going from a stage in the tradition and in the reality where Jesus probably doesn't know what's going on. My assumption is that Jesus did not have an envelope in his back pocket outlining what was going to happen, and you just lie very still for 3 days in the grave, then I'll come back and get you in a couple of days' time. I mean, he didn't know about resurrection when he was facing the prospect of crucifixion, kind of thing. I mean, I could put up with crucifixion if I was guaranteed a sort of get out of jail card in 3 days, and I'm no great hero, so So we sort of project a lot of stuff onto Jesus. So one of the transition is it's going from the expectations, the perspectives of the pre-Easter Jesus and his friends to the perspective and the beliefs and the values of the post-Easter community, where they begin to say, so maybe Jesus, and this is just me speculating obviously, but maybe Jesus wasn't just saying Son of Man as in, yours truly, this mother's son. Maybe when he kept saying Son of Adam, Son of Man, he was actually nudging us to think about the Daniel passage. So the whole developing a more eschatological view of the Son of Man sayings would be something which would occur naturally given all those transitions that are happening. And the question then is, how much of that can we project back onto the historical Jesus before Easter? And again, that's a whole minefield of hermeneutics and history and so on. Okay? But the point that Lutz is making is that no Aramaic speaker would have said the Son of the Man. The double article doesn't work in Aramaic or Hebrew. and yet Son of Man, with or without the articles, doesn't work in a Greek-speaking audience. So there's something bizarre going on here. Okay? But it's the most common title. Half of all the titles used, of the 4 titles, this title is used roughly the same number of times as all the rest combined. And yet most of the time, it really just means me. So it's not really a title. So you see how not that every time you see Son of Man, there's Jesus claiming to be the eschatological figure. Because most of the time, Son of Man just means, hi, me, I'm talking about myself. So it's slippery. So there's the references. And again, notice that you're not going to get it occurring at all until well after the Sermon on the Mount. So it doesn't feature in the infancy narratives, it doesn't feature in the opening scenes of the baptism and the temptation and so on. It doesn't feature in the Sermon on the Mount. It's only going to start kicking in towards the end of chapter 8. Okay? It's not going to be part of chapters 22, 23, 24. That's the conflict in Jerusalem. It's not part of that, but it does kick into some of the eschatological discourse in chapter 24, 25, and it becomes part of the interrogation of Jesus in front of the high priest. Okay? So again, it's as with the title Messiah, so Son of Man is distributed unevenly through the text, even though it's quite common.